So continuing with our understanding of interest rates, now we want to look at how does inflation and time affect interest rates. So in the world of interest rates, what we generally work with is what we call the nominal interest rate. The nominal interest rate is the rate of interest that has been quoted now. It is the interest rate that dictates to you, if you made an investment, how much you are getting back. So if the nominal interest rate, or NOM, is let's say 5%, then that tells you for a $100 investment today, you will be getting back $105 a year from now. That's the nominal. That's the stated interest rate. It tells you essentially the rate at which your money is growing if you invested it for a certain time period. But there's another aspect of interest rate that we need to tackle, and that's called the real interest rate. What real interest rate does is tells you by how much your money is not just growing, but after it has grown to $105, how much is this worth? How much is that worth? Which means it is adjusting our interest rate for inflation. So what is inflation? Inflation is essentially the growth in the price of a product over time. We officially define inflation to be not just the growth in the price of one product, but a basket of goods that is representative of the typical purchases an average American consumer will have. So when the basket of goods, the price of the basket of goods increases over time, that growth in price is inflation. Stated another way, if a basket of goods costs you $100 today, and that same basket of goods costs you $102 a year from now, then inflation over that period, inflation I, is about 2%. Because it is costing you $2 more or 2% more to buy the same basket of goods that you could have purchased a year ago at $100. Looked at another way, essentially, your dollar has lost 2% of its purchasing power. So inflation tells us to what extent the dollar is either retaining or losing its purchasing power. So once we have this, then we can look at what's the relationship between inflation, nominal rate, and real rate. So the real rate is going to tell us the growth in purchasing power. It is 1 plus the real rate. So if I invest $1 today at period 0, then at period 1, if that dollar has grown to 102, then my inflation is 2%. So that's what we're looking at over here. It is 1 plus the inflation rate tells me the growth in prices. Whereas 1 plus the real rate tells me the growth in purchasing power, and 1 plus the nominal rate tells me the growth of money, the actual nominal value of growth. So 1 plus our nominal rate, is 1 plus the real rate, or real, times 1 plus the rate of inflation. For very small numbers, if nominal, real, and inflation are small numbers, then we could write that nominal interest rate is approximately equal to the real interest rate plus inflation. but this is an approximation. It works only when interest rates and inflation rates are very low. But the full equation is this one. Okay. So again, approximately, real rate is nominal minus inflation. Now, in an economy, I can observe the nominal rate because that's the rate that is quoted in financial transactions. I can observe the rate of inflation because I'm tracking a basket of goods over time, and I can track what that inflation is going to be. But the real rate cannot be directly observed. It can only be inferred either through an equation like this in its exact form, or an equation like this in its approximate form. So this is an exact equation, and this is an approximation. Okay. So here we have the government bonds were stated at 3.3%, so that's my nominal rate. Inflation is 0.1%. What were the real interest rates in 2008? So very simply, the nominal rate minus the inflation rate divided by 1 plus the inflation rate. So 1 plus, R norm minus inflation divided by 1 plus inflation will be the real rate. This is basically a restatement of this equation. Just a simplification of this equation leads us to this equation. Or since the interest rates are small, so you can see the difference is about, the real rate is about 3.2%. If I had done 3.3 minus 0.1, I would also get 3.2%. So the exact equation and the approximate equation, they both lead to the same answer because these rates are so small. Okay. So we can calculate that. Over here, what we see that our nominal interest rate is highly correlated with inflation rate. Look at this. When the blue line goes up, the red line goes up, and vice versa. When the red line falls, the blue line falls. They're very correlated. What you also see is that the difference between nominal and inflation, which is the real interest rate, that difference, which is essentially this gap, is generally pretty small. So the real interest rate is generally pretty small, and it is pretty steady. Occasionally it widens, but generally speaking, that gap is a pretty steady number, which tells us that, generally speaking, real interest rate is much more stable. What causes nominal interest rate to fluctuate over time, one of the main drivers of nominal interest rate fluctuating over time is inflation rate. That's why inflation rates are so important. That's why the bond markets, the financial markets carefully monitor what the inflation rates are. So, and all of that, inflation, interest, all of that becomes the pillar of our, not just our interest rate policy, which of course is the main driver of our financial policy. And the impact interest rates had in the financial crisis is also very interesting. Consumer prices were falling in late 2008, so inflation rate was negative. We were almost in a deflationary period. So even with 0% nominal interest rate, the real interest rate remained positive, at least initially. Since the rates could not go lower than 0%, the United States began to consider other measures, such as increased government spending and investment to stimulate the economy. Generally, interest rate is a tool of our monetary policy that the government uses to either encourage investments or discourage investments. When investments are very low, inflation rates are very low, and the economy is slowing down, the government will typically cut interest rates so as to spur spending. When interest rate is cut, then people can borrow at a cheaper rate. When they borrow at a cheaper rate, they're more, particularly businesses, are more willing to borrow and invest. If the economy is overheating, and the way the Fed will find out when the economy is overheating is by looking at the inflation variable. If inflation is beginning to creep up, that's the sign that price of goods are increasing at a rapid rate. That would be a sign that there is an excessive demand for good. There is more money chasing the goods than there are goods available. That's what will cause good prices to go up. So demand is up, prices are up, inflation would be up. To slow down that growth, thus to discourage investment, discourage inflation, government will begin to increase interest rate. When interest rates increase, cost of borrowing goes up, businesses slow down on their investment. Also, an increase in interest rate implies that savings rates are higher, which would then encourage investors to save more and spend less. So interest rate becomes the driver of our monetary policy. The next thing we want to talk about is what is called the yield curve. The yield curve is based on an idea of what is called the term structure. And the term structure simply tells us that there is a relationship between the length of an investment or the investment term and the rate of interest. Generally speaking, if we are invested in the market for a longer period of time, then we would view that our investment is at greater risk, and then we may demand that the compensation for that greater risk is higher, thus interest rates will be higher for longer term investments. If that's the case, then, and if I look at interest rate today, let's say interest rate today is somewhere here. This is interest rate and this is term, the length at which I have invested in my investment in the market. So this is, let's say, a 1-year interest rate. And let's say 30 years, if I make a 30-year investment, interest rate is going to be here, then I can join these 2 points to show my yield curve. Which is essentially a plot of bond yields, something that we will learn a little bit later, as a function of the bond's maturity date, as a function of the time over which that investment is made. A 30-year investment in a treasury bond will give me a yield of this much. A 1-year investment on the same treasury gives me a yield of this much. So that means a 30-year bond has a higher annual interest rate than a 1-year bond. And why would that be? One of the reasons it could be that the 30-year bond requires me to be invested in the market for a longer period of time, and given the uncertainty over the future, I may demand a higher rate of investment. An accompanying idea to focus on over here is the idea of risk-free interest. Both a 1-year corporate treasury bond and a 30-year treasury bond would be considered risk-free. Meaning what? It does not mean that it is risk-free in the true sense of the word. It is risk-free because when the government issues bonds, as long as the government has the power to print money, they can always pay back whatever they have promised to their investors, to the people who purchase those bonds. The key is the government's ability to print money. That means the nominal value of the bond. If you go and you invest in a government bond, that means, let's say you gave $1,000 to the US government today, and the bond says that a year from now they will pay you 1,010 a year from now. the government will always be able to pay back this 1010. Even if they do not have enough money in the treasury at that moment, they can always print money and pay you back that 1010. That means this promise of getting back the 1010 is guaranteed. That's a guaranteed amount. That means the nominal value of the bond is guaranteed. Thus, the interest rate over this period, which is going to be 1%, the interest rate over that period is guaranteed. The nominal interest rate is guaranteed. In that sense, this nominal interest rate is risk-free. It is free of any risk. But it is not truly risk-free, because while the government can print money and pay you back that 1010, what you do not know is how much that money will be worth. If inflation goes up during that same period by, let's say, 2%, then in real terms, you have actually received less money than you had started off with. Although in nominal terms, you received more money than you started off with. So we have to be careful in interpreting what risk-free interest rate means. What it does not mean that it is risk-free in a true sense. It only means it is risk-free in a sense that it is default-free. By the way, the same promise cannot be made by other investment choices. A corporate bond cannot make you the same promise. A stock cannot make you the same promise. Your bank cannot make you the same promise. The only entity that can truly promise you a default-free investment is the federal government. And the reason they can do it is because legally we have given the federal government the authority to print money. So now when we look at interest rates over time, so we are looking at interest rate in 2006, a year for an interest rate over a year, if the term is for 1 year, it is 4.9%. If the term is for 2 years, it's 4.8%, and so on and so forth. So what do we see? That for a 1-year bond in November 2006, interest rate was here, whereas for a 20-year bond, the interest rate was somewhere here. In 2008, for a 1-year bond, interest rate was here, but for a 20-year bond, the interest rate was here. So 2006, over time, interest rate went down and then flattened. 2008, interest rate went up and then flattened. This picture is called the term structure of interest rate. It gives us a sense of what the interest rate is for different investment horizons, for different investment time. To what extent do the interest rates change? From this, what it allows us to do is it allows us to calculate present value or the value of investment choices for risk-free cash flows, essentially using the present value, future value thing that we had learned before. Present value is future value in period n divided by 1 plus the interest rate over that n period raised to the power n. So Rn is the risk-free interest rate for a n-year term. So for a 1-year term, that Rn is 4.9. For a 5-year term, that Rn is 4.64. It changes, right? Because it changes perhaps because people are expecting different inflation rate. One of the reasons in 2008 interest rates were low is because inflation was low. Why are investors expecting interest rate to go up over the next 20 years? Because they're expecting inflation rates to go up. Why was inflation low over here? Because the economy was in recession. Prices were going down. But as the economy recovers, and the expectation is for the economy to recover, then prices will begin to go up, which would mean inflation will begin to go up, which will then drive up the interest rate. So if I have different cash flows over different period of time, but in each of these period, interest rate is different. So now what do I have is the following. Let's say 1, 2, 3, 4. Now over period 1, interest rate is R1. But over a 2-year period, let's say interest rate is R2. Why do we say that? Because we see this over here. Over a 1-year period, interest rate is here. Over a 2-year period, interest rate is here. Two different numbers. Now I cannot use the same number now over the 2 years that I used over 1 year. So R2 is the annual interest rate over 2 years. R3 is the annual interest rate over 3 years. And so on and so forth. Then I have to use different interest rates as my discount factors to calculate present value. And that's what we have over here as an example. For a 5-year annuity, $1,000 per year, what's going to be the present value? So you know you have to calculate present value. How do you do this? Well, it's a 1,000-year annuity over 5 years, so the cash flow is the same. But what is changing? What is changing is that interest rate over that 5 years is changing. And how do I know that? I go back here. Interest rate is changing. 0.91, 0.98, 1.26, 1.69, and 2.01. So I'm now going to use those interest rates. So 0.91%, so that becomes 0.0091. 1 plus 0.0098, because this was 0.91%, this was 0.98%. This was 1.26%. This was 1.69%, and this was 2.01%. I got this from the yield curve, which is over here. The yield curve over here for November 2008. Now I put this into this equation over here. I calculate each present value separately, and then I add them up. And that gives me the present value of those 5 $1,000 payment, which is different from what we had learned earlier. Because in earlier annuities, we had assumed that the interest rate over this time period is the same. Interest rate over 1 year, over 2 years, over 3 years, over 4 years, over 5 years is the same annual rate. Now what we are saying is that because of a term structure, because of the yield curve, that interest rate is not necessarily going to be the same. And if it is not the same, then I have to individually calculate the present values to calculate the overall present value of my cash flow. So the yield curve tells us the market interest rate per year. Keep point over here, market interest rate per year for different time to maturity. So we will need to use the 5 different interest rates corresponding to those maturities. So thus we cannot use the annuity formula. We cannot use it because interest rate is variable. Interest rate is changing over time. So here we have term structure of interest rate in July 2009. Here is my annuity of $2,500. Cash flows are the same, but interest rates are different. So obviously, I cannot use the annuity formula. I have to individually discount each one of them, and I have to add them up. Similar example over here, you can work them out. And I talked a little bit about this. The interest rate is determined by the federal funds rate, which is an overnight loan that is charged by banks with excess reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank to banks that need additional fund. At the end of each day in the banking market, Some banks will have more deposits than liabilities, and some banks will have less deposits than liabilities. So some banks will have extra cash, and some banks will have cash deficits. Thus, the banks with cash deficits will have to borrow funds from the banks with extra cash to cover the deficit temporarily, overnight. And this happens every day. That exchange of loan overnight is done at what is called the federal funds rate. And the Federal Reserve determines this rate. And it determines this to influence the federal funds rate so that it can determine the overnight borrowing between banks. And thus the federal funds rate becomes the benchmark rate against which every other interest rate is benchmarked, because it is the least risky type of borrowing that institutions engage in. It is between two institutions, large institutions, and it is over a very short period of time, just overnight. So it is virtually risk-free, and thus it is the minimum benchmark, and from that interest rates are determined. So if the federal funds rate go up, long interest rates will go up. When federal funds rate fall, interest rates will fall. And of course, the term structure will be determined by whether people expect inflation to go up in the future or inflation to go down in the future. So if you look at this interest rate curve over here, the yield curve in 2008 was upward sloping, but in 2006 it was somewhat downward sloping. Why? Because short-term inflation was high. People expected the economy to slow down, and thus they expected inflation to fall. So when people are expecting inflation to fall, yield curves are downward sloping. When people are expecting inflation to rise, yield curves are upward sloping. Okay. So yield curves can be normal, inverted, or steep. So here we have a normal yield curve, slightly upward sloping, more steep yield curve, or inverted yield curve. Sometimes yield curves can just be flat like this also. So you can also have a flat yield curve. Okay. So that completes this chapter. I will not be covering section 5.4. You're not responsible for that. So that ends chapter 5.